Welcome to the online panel, State of Play. Where are we in establishing the employer pays principle as normal practice, and what more needs to happen? This session will explore initiatives and improvements to recruitment and also look towards the future to assess what more needs to be done to consistently implement the employer pays principle, or EPP. Thank you to IHRB for including this State of Play session in the lineup today. I am especially pleased to be here because Labor Mobility Partnerships has been working on this topic ourselves across different corridors. As part of our goal of creating better job opportunities for 500 million workers from low-income countries by 2050, we are grappling with the same challenges as our panelists. Namely, how do we implement more responsible practices while also attaining scale? I am pleased to be joined by three very knowledgeable panelists who will walk us through their experiences, lessons learned, and the approaches they plan to take in the future. Here we have Ben Bostock from Impact, Hannah Newcomb from Stronger Together, and Tom Smith from Walmart. The question that I've asked Hannah and Ben to address first is, what is the most important progress towards implementing the employer pays principle that you've seen over the past 12 months? Specifically, we'd love to know what you have personally been working on to put this principle into action. I'll introduce you, Ben, first and ask you to start the conversation, and then I'll move over to Hannah. So Ben Bostock is a principal consultant at Impact Limited. Impact is an employee-owned consultancy that specializes in ethical trade and human rights. Ben has led teams to deliver forced labor, modern slavery, and worker welfare investigations in Europe, the Gulf, and Asia, and provided consulting support and training in remediation of issues, including for Top Glove in Malaysia and for the Supreme Committee of Delivery and Legacy in Qatar for the FIFA World Cup. He will touch on different mechanisms and approaches to implementing the EPP. Ben, it's great to have you here.
Thanks, Alicia. Great question to begin with. And I think there's a couple of angles. So firstly, at the kind of broad spectrum, the greatest progress I think that we're seeing is actually down to the advancement of legislation at the national level and international level. This was starting with the US CBP using the Tariffs Act to start to enact WROs. And then the knock-on effect from these things was definitely seeing companies put under WRO and have to take action to get these modified. Other companies then watching this in the news would, of course, then it would incentivize them to improve their prevention mechanisms for prevention of recruitment fees. These laws then being enacted and copycatted in other countries. You think, Canada's doing something similar, in the EU as well. The more that this happens, the more progress we're seeing based on those legal regulatory requirements that are coming into play. But I know you also asked about the sort of the more micro level and what we've been doing ourselves to work on this issue. So at Impact, we've been helping a number of companies to do various things at the policy level, the procedure level, and of course, working that into practice. What we've been primarily doing is encouraging companies to work on open tenders for their recruitment agencies. So instead of just having the same recruitment agencies that they use time and time again, which have led to problems in the past, we're kind of, encouraging them to scrap the books, start again with an open tender, have that open to everyone so that the companies can compete with one another in an open and transparent way, these agencies. And we want to see the agencies breaking down the costs of recruitment, the different elements required in recruitment, so that the companies assessing the tender, so the companies that we're working with directly, when they assess the tender, they can actually assess the different itemizations of the recruitment, what it should cost, whether the different elements of it are indeed the right elements. They can use various different sources to see whether those are the right elements that they've costed at the correct price. So it shouldn't be overpriced. It certainly shouldn't be underpriced, because that could be indicative that they're going to then recoup those costs from workers. And just having those transparent points of comparison is really, really helpful. What we've also been encouraging them to do is to extend their grievance mechanisms to candidates during recruitment, and to also require their recruitment agencies to share that information with candidates during recruitment. So then, when the candidates have any questions, any concerns, when they just want to know anything at all during their recruitment process, hey, I've been approached by this actor asking for this payment for this purpose. They're saying it's for a medical fee. Is this legitimate, or should this have been covered already? So that the candidates having access to that helpline really assists the whole due diligence process.
Thank you, Ben. I'm really interested to hear that you are implementing what I would call, it sounds a bit like an auditing process into the tenders. And I imagine that requires a lot of in-depth knowledge and gathering about the kind of data that you should be getting. And I'm curious about how that works, but we'll leave it there for now. And maybe we can incorporate some of more information about that as we move on. And from here, I'll move to Hannah. Hannah Newcomb is the co-CEO of Stronger Together. Stronger Together is a not-for-profit that provides businesses with practical training, resources, business services, and collaborative programs in order to create a world where all workers are recruited responsibly and have fair work, free from exploitation. Hannah has been working to provide a range of guidance, training, and resources specifically focused on implementing the employer pays principle and eliminating worker-paid recruitment fees. She will speak today about the seasonal workers scheme of the United Kingdom as an example of how to practically move towards an EPP model in a context where national law and national commitment to the UN Global Compact on Migration are potentially at odds. Hannah, please take it away and let us know what you're working on and what you've seen change over the last year or so.
Thank you, Alicia, for that introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to share some perspectives in today's session. So Stronger Together, we work in multiple countries around the world, but today I wanted to focus on some specific practical examples from the UK, where, as you said in that introduction, Alicia, implementation of the employer pays principle has proven to be particularly challenging for businesses because we see these challenges in the legislation not matching up with some of the commitments. So in the UK, in most cases, when it comes to recruitment fees, as defined in the ILO General Principles and Operational Guidelines, it is illegal for workers to pay those fees. But for related costs, in most cases, it is legal in the UK for migrant workers to incur those costs. So we're talking about things like the cost of visas, visa processing, and transportation costs between countries. So in other words, the UK law is at odds with the employer pays principle in the ILO definition of recruitment fees and related costs. The UK government demonstrated its support for the employer pays principle back in 2018 through the Principles for Tackling Modern Slavery in Supply Chains. That was alongside Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the US. And it reiterated its support in its modern slavery statement. It's also, as he said, a signatory to the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, which includes provisions around prohibiting recruiters and employers from charging or shifting recruitment fees or related costs to migrant workers. So there does seem to be this disconnect between UK law and the government's own commitments. And what that means is that there's no statutory requirement for businesses to cover these costs of recruitment within the UK, and therefore it has to be a voluntary decision to do so. And we do have in the UK a number of UK retailers that have signed up to the employer pays principle through the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment. And what we've seen is specifically in the UK seasonal workers scheme that significant concerns were raised last year around some migrant workers on seasonal worker visas taking on debt to come to the UK, including debt to cover those costs of recruitment, so the visa processing and the transportation. And so there have been significant discussions over the last 6 months, really, and more recently kind of formalised through a multi-stakeholder seasonal worker scheme task force, which we are the secretariat for. So within that, there have been discussions around implementing the employer pays principle specifically in the UK seasonal worker scheme, which is just for UK horticulture, as well as later in the year for some seasonal poultry. So at Stronger Together, we support the employer pays principle and clearly recognise the risk faced by workers of going into debt to migrate, and particularly in this context of a seasonal worker visa, which is for 6 months, a 6-month visa, and there's actually no guarantee of 6 months work within that visa. So those costs workers might be incurring are potentially not for a full 6 months of work. But we also recognise that it needs constructive dialogue with all parties in the supply chain alongside worker representative organisations in order to make progress. And we have seen some signs of progress in the last few months. So I think broadly there is willingness amongst businesses to make progress towards the employer pays principle, but wanting also to ensure that that's sustainable for all parties in the supply chain. We did some very initial analysis on the cost of implementing the employer pays principle in the UK seasonal workers scheme, which had multi-stakeholder input. So very roughly, because these were initial calculations, for a grower to take on those costs would be about a 400% increase in the cost of recruiting the worker, which then roughly equates to around a 3 to 6% increase in the price they would need to sell their products on to the supplier or onto the retailer, which may not sound like a lot, but the feedback from growers, this is challenging on their current margins. So the conversation is now kind of moving on to where those costs can be assumed within the supply chain, if there's broadly consensus that they need to shift away from workers. And we are now looking at, can we do some research with some more sophisticated economic modelling to actually support those buying companies to have those necessary discussions with the commercial teams, because it has to get to those commercial teams, to understand what those implications are. We have also seen policy and worker representative organisations raising the employer pays principle with the government. And there's also ongoing work to draw up country by country comparisons of countries with seasonal agricultural schemes which do apply a model much closer to or akin to the employer pays principle, to try and have that evidence base to show, well, can it work and is it working, an employer pays model in a seasonal agricultural scheme in other countries. So there is lots of progress happening, but still some way to go. And I would say right now, most and indeed potentially all migrant workers currently entering the UK through the seasonal workers scheme are paying those upfront costs to enter the scheme. Just quickly to finish on where we have seen some ethical recruitment on an employer pays model is in the skilled worker visa route in the UK. So that's an immigration route that has also been associated with significant risks of unethical practices, but where we have also seen some pilots where employers are covering the full costs of recruitment on an employer pays model. I think the differences are that in that scheme, the skilled worker visa allows up to 5 years of work and the ability to settle permanently in the UK. So that potentially means employers see covering those costs as more of a long-term investment and therefore more kind of viable economically for them. So some progress that we're seeing, but more to further to go.
Thank you, Hannah. That is so interesting. I was reflecting on the economic analysis you did, and it sounds very valuable, given that I think sometimes we think about this principle and it feels like people think that the capital to cover the costs will just come from thin air. And so when we look at an industry like agriculture that has such thin margins, understanding that this results in a 3 to 4% increase in price to the consumer is actually really important, because the whole system can collapse if we see a price change like that. And so knowing that you're looking at different routes and different levels of skills where higher margins might result in different designs is very interesting. And I hope you'll share more as you build more information about this, because it's I haven't seen a lot of work on that. And I think it would be helpful for everyone to understand the results of these studies and these designs that you're building. So you ended on some challenges, and I'll use that to parlay the conversation over to Tom to talk a little bit about the challenges that we've been seeing. So the question that I'll have for you, Tom, is what's holding us back from a full implementation of the employer pays principle? Would love to hear about the barriers to adoption by current employers, and looking into our future, where do we think that we may need to start tackling some of those barriers to reach a scaled job placement? And so moving to Tom, I will introduce Tom as the Director of Government Affairs at Walmart. He is supporting the business by managing for geopolitical risk, sourcing, sustainability, human rights, and relationships with multilateral organizations and the EU to help us understand some of the barriers that we need to overcome in this space. Tom, given your focus on government affairs, I'm really interested to hear what you have to say here.
Yeah, thanks very much, Alicia, and great to join everyone at this event. Yeah, I mean, I should very much echo a lot of the points kind of being made. I think just to add to the first question, I think the point that Ben made about legislation, we have seen fantastic progress with that, but there's a lot to be done. So let me get onto that in a sec. But I guess the first point, there's no doubt that there's a huge amount still to be done. But I think if we look back, certainly Walmart and the Walmart Foundation have been involved in this topic kind of since its inception. There has the awareness raising of this topic, it's been immense. I know there's still a huge amount of detail to work through. We're kind of hearing some of these kind of key challenges that Hannah was bringing up now with the current kind of environment. But, it's good to look back and see some, progress, and certainly the awareness and the understanding of this topic area. It was kind of 5+ years ago. A lot of these talks were just trying to explain what it is and what everyone was trying to do. So we kind of need to see some kind of positive progress in that regard. But yeah, I guess on in terms of kind of the full implementation, it's a big question, but I'll kind of pick away at it, certainly probably more from the kind of government affairs point of view. And I think it's first worth pointing out for those of you kind of relatively new to, maybe some of the audience be kind of relatively new to this topic, it's these kind of human rights issues are kind of complex and the result of quite broad systematic issues, including deeply entrenched either sort of economic practices, workers lacking knowledge, support, or tools to safeguard their risks, and this kind of inconsistent government regulation and enforcement. We kind of heard about it a minute ago across multiple different countries. So I think it's really, really important, and I'll get back to this in a minute, for all companies and all governments and all NGOs to be working together on this. Unlike some issues, there's no one kind of entity is going to really be able to kind of fix this. So I think the two big pieces on this, and we can maybe come back to it on the role of business, but I think the critical element is going to be around kind of aligning government standards and aligning kind of international standards on the kind of global standards piece. So I think particularly from a government point of view, we're hearing Hannah about some of the issues in the UK, and certainly from our perspective, we're looking at this in a variety of different supply chains. The sort of cross-border nature of this issue requires this increasing dialogue between governments. You might even have kind of between governments or between regions, and this kind of variety of international frameworks and laws and policies that can potentially improve the lives of workers. So I think it's really critical. Certainly, we do a lot of engagements with different government organizations to kind of encourage new systems, new controls, and the enforcement of either existing laws, because sometimes that's the issue. It's just, it's not about creating something new, but about actually just enforcing something that's in place already. And I think it's really important for other companies, not just Walmart and others, but a whole variety of kind of NGOs and governments to put pressure. And I think it's through this direct conversations and collaboration with governing bodies of sending and receiving countries. It's trying to kind of encourage these strong labor laws and systems for inspection, the greater enforcement of laws, and a whole kind of bunch of different areas. So it's really kind of critical to get that piece on. And I think it's also, and this kind of pulls into this kind of international piece, is about governments also working together on the international kind of regulations. We've seen a whole bunch of different kind of pockets of activity. We had this engagement and still do with the Bali Process, with Bali Process Government, a business forum. We've had a variety of discussions within the UN. There's been some interesting output from the kind of US EU Trade and Technology Council, kind of where forced labor came up last week, I think it was, or this week. I've lost track of my diary. But I think it's critical that these international forums can come up with some consistent regulation that can then be transposed into kind of national pieces. Because I think whilst we're seeing, there's going to be individual circumstances in each country. We're kind of hearing from Hannah about the issues in the UK, but creating these kind of global standards and global regulations that each country can draw down onto will help companies like ourselves roll out policies that can be consistent across all these different markets. Because the challenge here is that if we see different pockets of solutions and framing or guidance that are entirely different in each country, certainly for brands like us, but others, it's very difficult to scale single big solutions and big commitments if you're seeing all these different kind of mechanisms dotted around in different markets. So I really think this piece around this kind of international coherence on kind of mechanisms and guidance, and there's a lot that's been done on this already, but there's a lot more that can be done on that piece. So yeah, certainly kind of global standards and kind of how governments work on these, both in terms of their domestic policies and the kind of international forums. But yeah, just some initial thoughts on that.
Thank you, Tom. What a great point about how difficult it is to roll out policy in the context of so many different regulatory frameworks. I cannot imagine how difficult that must be. So I wish you luck with getting everybody aligned and putting some pressure on folks to get on the same page so that we can actually move forward to build solutions at scale. Ben and Hannah, I'm curious about the challenges that you're seeing. Ben, why don't you start off with what you're seeing from where you sit?
Sure. And yeah, just to echo Tom's points, super important for governments to be working together on these things, bridging between national and kind of international good practices. Because what we still see a lot of, sadly, and some of the investigations that we get involved in at Impact will be around or will, at least involve elements of corruption, elements of kickbacks. We're constantly seeing, deals with recruitment agencies and companies themselves whereby, even if they're not paying directly and there's not money going on the books directly to these companies, instead it will be coming in the form of kickbacks where the company's HR representatives will go and visit these recruitment agencies in their home country, be put up in 5-star hotels for weeks on end, be wined and dined, business class flights, these kind of things. So there's so many ways to get past the to sort of pay back in kind, even if it's not going officially on the books, that we're sadly still seeing, whilst awareness is rising about these things. And you kind of think about as well, there is generally more knowledge that these things are going on, and the ILO's definition of recruitment fees of 2019 is certainly helpful at making various players more aware of the normality of those kind of things and how to watch out for these things. We're also still sadly seeing, government to government agreements in recruitment, which I'm sure Tom you'll struggle with and know all about. But some of these government to government agreements to do with recruitment still very much allow and propose for fees for the charging of recruitment, because it's still seen as a commodity. It's still a big business. There's so many different players making their money off the recruitment of workers. And so, you think Malaysia to Bangladesh through 2016 to 2018, this was, hugely profitable government to government agreements, which took so much money off so many workers. And the costs of recruitment fees during that period was just astronomically high. But we're still seeing those kinds of government to government agreements now. And there's a case that we're working on where, a company has had to apply for workers through its own government. And then that government is the only one that can kind of approve the recruitment of migrant workers. But the arrangement it has with the sending country, with the workers' origin country, is to charge $8,000 per worker to get those workers across, and that's purely at the government level. And so we're still very much having to deal with those kinds of issues, and it's very difficult for us as Impact. We're a private company. It's not necessarily like we can work on those kinds of cases at that scale. So that's certainly an impediment to progress that we're seeing and having to grapple with.
Thank you, Ben. That sounds like an enormous impediment to grapple with as a private company, and I can understand how you would have limited reach to be able to influence it. Hannah, how about you? What's your experience with the challenges that we're still facing now?
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. I think just building on what Tom and Ben have said, I think the other challenge is those illicit and legal informal parties that seem to be kind of proliferating within the recruitment process, both in sending countries and also in destination countries, but those that can kind of infiltrate the legitimate supply chain. And I know that the businesses in the UK, particularly within the work that we're doing in the UK seasonal worker scheme, but we do see this in other processes, are finding that a real challenge where we have individuals or illicit brokers that are targeting workers before they enter that formal recruitment process, already charging fees, and then workers are already indebted when they're coming into or accessing the job advert for the first time, that's legitimate, that kind of first legitimate point in the recruitment process. And I think it was interesting, Ben, what you were saying earlier around the importance of grievance mechanisms within the recruitment process as well as the employment process, which we'd absolutely agree with, and we kind of promote within our guidance. But the concern is that, and what we've heard actual examples of, is workers fearing raising the issues during the recruitment process because that they fear that they won't be selected for work, where if they raise it later, perhaps they have a greater chance of accessing remedy. So I think that is something that businesses are kind of grappling with, certainly here in the UK. I think what's holding back on this issue is, effective enforcement of those illicit and criminal actors, remediation for workers that have paid those illicit fees. And we know on that question of remedy and responsibility for remedy, again, that's proven to be a real challenge to get organisations to agree to take responsibility for actions of brokers or individuals that have no formal supply chain link with them. And I think, echoing what Tom and Ben have said about the importance of those government to government agreements, I think those including, the actions that are being taken around enforcement of those acting criminally and illicitly is a key part of that as well.
Thank you, Hannah. It sounds like we're experiencing many of the same things in our agricultural corridor between Mexico and the United States in terms of worker indebtedness and trying to get real information, real data, and grievances systems set up to ensure that people can safely report and safely share their truth. It's a big challenge that we're facing as well. So moving on from the challenges, I'm hoping we can take this to a place of solutions and hopefully focus the second half of the conversation on some inspiration for everyone about what do we see going forward, how might incentives or solutions that are on the horizon, even if we haven't solved for them yet, help us move forward. And so in yesterday's keynote, my colleague Rebecca Smith shared that millions of visas in many receiving countries around the world are going unfilled because of the barriers that we're talking about. So employers and workers facing excessive costs in migration systems or not having access or knowledge about what could be available to them. And in particular, we find that companies that have never used a labor migration channel, so new entrants into the system, are really likely to need some extensive support in order to navigate these systems. There's a lot of complexity on the regulatory level, visa processing. They have a lot of fear about what does it mean to take responsibility for people coming from other countries to make sure I do everything properly. And where they're just starting out, we've found that sometimes employers may find that paying for all worker-related expenses to be quite difficult. Maybe talking just about recruitment, but there's also training and other costs that accompany recruitment in many cases. And so it's not just cash flow limitations, but sometimes just facing the uncertainty of adopting a new approach that requires significant investment feels like a lot of risk to employers. And so we at LAMP have been working on ways that we could find business incentives to help employers and supply chains embrace more of the employer pays principle, and also thinking about sharing risk and sharing value along the value chain. So I'm very curious personally to hear what you've learned and see what we can learn from each other about how we can incentivize employers in this case to take on more risk and to take on more of the cost. Keeping in mind, as Hannah, you said from your first comment, that this expense doesn't come from nowhere. It does trickle up and it trickles down to everybody. And so what's the best way to share these expenses? Ben, do you want to start us off on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. So the incentives, just to kind of echo what Tom was talking about before as well. One of the greatest incentives is still going to be the stick rather than the carrot. So greater government legislation and greater enforcement of that as well is going to be hugely important here, because in our experience, that's what companies are constantly worried about. That's what they're constantly asking about whenever we visit them. Is what do we have to do? It's still that is still very much the case for the vast majority of the companies. The fear of the kind of big bill of remediation of a recruitment fee repayment, that is becoming bigger and bigger, with the cases you think like Top Glove and Sime Darby, these kinds of cases where you're into the tens, even, Top Glove was $40 million US plus in terms of that big bill for just the recruitment fees repayment, let alone everything else that becomes a cost in remediation of wider forced labor issues. Those big bills, actually, on the remediation side, those then also incentivize the improving creation, expansion of policies and procedures to prevent reoccurrence in the future. So actually, even though it comes from a sort of more stick place rather than a carrot place in the first place, that creates the incentive ongoing, both within the company itself, but other companies, other peers will then watch that and are then acting independently and are fully incentivized to act on prevention as a result of these things. And if you're looking at what happened in the all across Malaysia, particularly with the rubber glove sector, largely because of companies that were placed under WRO and acted accordingly. There were companies very much just independently doing the same kind of work, and they were very much incentivized to do that, even though there was no kind of WRO placed on them. They just knew that there was that kind of potential threat, and so they were naturally incentivized. So that just really indicates how powerful though that legislation can be if it's enforced correctly, but also how powerful the knowledge of how big a bill could potentially be, to make sure that they're then putting in place employer pays principle and various preventative mechanisms in future. The other thing I would like to mention as well is helping companies to cover the costs associated with recruitment, because companies are more and more realizing just how many different elements, how many different itemizations there are to the recruitment of every individual worker, which can sometimes be an eye-opening process for the companies as we work through this with them, because before it may well have been that they just paid a flat rate per worker and didn't really see where the money went. So just knowledge of how much this can actually cost. Thinking about that, we can also think about, could there be some form of kind of working capital fund that companies pay into that they can then access to cover, so that recruiters can use this fund to cover recruitment costs at the recruitment stage, because often it's the availability and the liquidity of access to money that can prevent a barrier to doing this properly. One thing that Impact has been working on for the last couple of years is the remedy bond. So the idea that different companies can pay into a central bond that can then be accessed. It's primarily the first use and the first trials are going to be for repayment of recruitment fees. But if these go successfully, this sort of bond can definitely be used for access to this kind of working capital as well, for the actual recruitment process to help recruitment agencies and to help companies to ensure that the costs of recruitment are covered. And the idea of this kind of bond is that, it's kind of managed by a financial institution. Those that pay into it can be, it can be brands, it can be the companies themselves. And there is just this accessible pot of money that can then be repaid. But what it means is that there's never that barrier to actually accessing the money in the first place. But yeah, I'll pass back over.
Great, thank you. And it sounds like that's a great solution for when timing is an issue or liquidity is an issue, and it helps move things forward in terms of creating a mechanism or an intermediating force that can allow us to overcome some barriers. Hannah, what is your thought? I know you probably know a lot about the remediation bond as well, and what else are you seeing that's interesting in terms of overcoming barriers?
Yeah, I think, adding to what Ben said there around effective legislation enforcement and the kind of financial mechanisms, I think thinking about supply chains specifically, there needs to be those clear market signals from all parties. So employers that are, moving to the employer pays principle, that they've got that market signal from their buyers, that they are committed to that's actually translating into commercial buying practices at each stage in the supply chain to support the implementation of the employer pays principle. So transparent costing, at each level in the labour supply chain to ensure those full costs of recruitment, overheads, and a sustainable margin, so that it is a sustainable practice. That's other purchasing practices like good labour planning and reasonable lead times, because we know that where that's not in place, then that can have a knock on to the impact be felt by the most vulnerable workers. Long-term contracts, strategic partnerships between buyers and suppliers, and between suppliers and recruiters, just to kind of have the systems to support the employer pays principle being commercially sustainable within the supply chains. I think as well, without legislation in place to level the playing field and to move beyond the early adopters, I think businesses also want to be able to demonstrate the commercial benefits of implementing an employer pays model, where on paper it may seem more expensive. So I think understanding the true cost, as Ben said, so that true cost may be higher than the business thought, but actually it's often lower than what workers are currently paying, particularly if steps can be taken to sort of formalize the recruitment process and remove costs that are actually unnecessary, that workers are paying, and other steps to minimize costs, things like organized transport, that we have seen kind of pockets of good practice to bring that sort of unit cost per worker down. Understanding how the costs can be fairly distributed across the supply chain, as we've said. And then I think broader evidence of the wider business benefits of an employer pays principle approach. So starting to gather that evidence of improved worker satisfaction, reduced risks to the businesses, and that ability to differentiate on the basis of responsible recruitments. That's something, for example, through our Clearview scheme for farm labour contractors in the US, we've supported those organisations to be able to differentiate on the basis of responsible recruitment credentials. And I think those kinds of initiatives, we've got the IOM with their IRIS scheme that have been doing similar work on cross-border recruitment to enable those that are seeking to go first on these recruitment standards to get that recognition. I think finally I would say support for further education, information, and support for workers to understand their rights and entitlements, identify what those ethical recruitment opportunities are, and then access remedy where they've paid fees and costs. We work with Just Good Work. They're a partner of ours. They've been doing some great work on this in countries around the world, including in the UK seasonal workers scheme.
Thank you. You said two things that I want to pull out of your note here, which was, one is long-term contracts between suppliers and buyers. I thought that was interesting, and it's something that we've seen a lot of as well. Is a challenge right now is that often, especially in sectors like agriculture that are very much a commodity, it's really a labyrinth to know who's in the supply chain. There are a lot of different actors involved, and it's difficult to make long-term commitments when you're not entirely sure who you're committing to. And one piece of hope that I see here, which is part of a conversation we had with one of our corporate partners recently, was that there's a lot of work being done to map supply chains for carbon footprint and for climate sustainability. And it feels like there's a lot of resource being put behind that effort and a lot of enthusiasm for it on the public's part. And so all of that mapping work may be able to be repurposed and recycled into more transparency that we can use in the human rights sector. Maybe I can ask you if this is something that you've seen, and if not, we can move on. But I'm curious about your kind of success in helping build these long-term contracts between suppliers and buyers, and any hope that you might see in changes in terms of transparency in supply chains.
Yeah, I mean, I do think on the transparency piece, we've seen those challenges, and we've seen them being, different in different sectors and different countries around the world. So I would say in the UK, there are reasonable levels of transparency down to the grower level, and now starting to move, through the recruitment supply chains as well. So I think there's been progress made there, and then that does support businesses to then work towards those longer term contracts. I would say the progress on that side of things is perhaps catching up a bit, but certainly in other sectors that we work in around the world, that transparency piece is really challenging, and I think that is a key starting point in order to then work on developing those longer term partnerships within supply chains.
It's great. It's a worthy efforts to be making. And the other thing that you said that rang a bell for me was coming back to Ben's discussion about being able to differentiate between costs. So I won't ask you to speak more to it, but just that this is a theme that's coming up, is educating employers and educating people along the supply chain to know what should things really cost, what should recruitment actually cost, and what are the itemized expenses there. So that keeps coming up again and again, and I think it's worth calling out because you've both mentioned it. So Tom, I'll pass it to you and ask what kinds of business incentives, especially sitting in a corporate seat, you could see as being particularly interesting to help employers get over the hurdle of moving towards the employer pays principle. And they may be hurdles of willingness, or they may just be hurdles of timing or structure of the way that payments work. But I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about this.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think I'll just build on what everyone said already, I think, because it's kind of completely aligned. I think the key for us, Hannah, you put it really well with the clear market signals. I think that was a kind of great point, because we need other companies to step up to this as well. It's not, we made the big commitments back in 2016 for this to be a huge kind of focus area for the business. And the Walmart Foundation put a lot of money behind it as well, and there needs to be these other market signals. There has to be a greater level playing field. I think both we a lot of talk about the legislative piece, but it's essential to have other businesses step up as well, because that will make our lives easier in rolling this in our supply chain. Because the problem is we've made these big commitments, we put a huge amount of kind of brand and actual kind of cash investment in this, but if other major retailers or other brands don't make the same commitments, that's incredibly challenging for us as well. So I think, just purely put, trying to get other companies to make these big, bold statements, I think obviously legislation is going to be a big incentive to that. You've got market reputations as a big incentive for that. But, Alicia, you were talking about, the parallels with the climate world that we obviously work really closely as well. That's to see that's just, all of the activity on that is expected practice. There isn't, everyone's expected that the bar is set pretty steady there. And anyone that isn't reaching that kind of minimal level is kind of really called out. It would be fantastic for this topic and this issue to reach that same level of recognition where just this is expected practice. This isn't some philanthropy or some extra program or whatever. This is just something that companies do as part of day-to-day compliance. That's the aspiration. And we need other companies to kind of step up and help push this forward. And at that point, the whole kind of market will move from that point. And we're not there yet. I mean, that's the reality that we're all hearing. If there's only a few companies, even if they're the size and scale of us, you need all these other companies to also step up, either voluntarily or through legislation. And it kind of snowballs from that point. So I think really encouraging other companies to kind of step up in the same way that Walmart has, I think is going to be really critical for this.
So now we need an economist on the panel to tell us how to manage this game theory of the situation, right? What is the chicken and what is the egg? And how do we get everybody to move forward at the same time? I will not ask you to answer that question. I think it's a little bigger than we can tackle in this format. But I want to change gears a little bit right now and move over to thinking more specifically about the worker and the worker's experience. One of the things that we're really concerned about with at LAMP is thinking about how growth as growth in the labor mobility industry has the potential to put more control in the workers' hands, because the more opportunity that is available to workers, the more choice they will have. And so we actually believe there's an interesting series of things that needs to happen to get to a point where workers can say, well, that sounds like an interesting opportunity, but I'm more interested in this other one. And I'm willing to invest in my future. I want to make certain choices because they work better for me. Here's how I think I would do that. While we have a really constrained system and capital constraints, it's very difficult for the worker to be able to access opportunities because there are so few opportunities that supply demand is just, it's not in the worker's favor at this point in time. And so as we move to thinking more about worker agency and thinking about some of the levers that workers might have to be able to control their destiny, make choices before we actually get to scale, because we think scale is an important end goal or important, it's both an important end goal and it's an important lever. What can we do before we reach scale? How can we give workers more agency in this process themselves? Hannah, I'll start with you and then I'll move to Tom and then Ben, and then we'll have a quick wrap up at the end of that conversation to see if there are any questions that we want to ask one between ourselves as a group to build on anything that we've said today in the panel. So Hannah, worker agency, I'm wondering what you're seeing and if you have any thoughts about how we can infuse a little bit more of it into our designs.
Yeah, I mean, I had a couple of reflections on this. I mean, firstly, in terms of kind of the quality of information that's reaching workers, we've been seeing a lot of concerns about social media and the impact it can have on targeting vulnerable workers with fraudulent job adverts and scams. So I think it's about how can we combat that with, projects that look at using social media as a force for scaling accurate information to reach workers. I think alongside that, we have seen some examples of work to enable workers and migrant workers to rate their recruiters and employers and to get that kind of information out to workers. But I don't know to what degree that's kind of scaled yet. So I think, workers having that agency to kind of be able to look at, the quality and the previous experiences of job seekers and workers when they select the job that they're going for. But I think obviously that relies on workers feeling that they have that agency to select those opportunities. And something we have seen as a challenge in the UK, where we are currently we have significant labour shortages, but we aren't really seeing that translate into, in theory, that should translate to better and higher quality opportunities, but we are seeing risks within the labour market here. We are seeing concerns that labour shortage is actually leading to cutting corners, reduction in due diligence. So I think it's ensuring that those conditions are there for workers to feel that they've got that agency to make those choices. And a lot of that is much wider macroeconomic challenges around the economic situation within countries, the impact of conflict, the impact of climate change that we are seeing on workers at the moment. So I think there's a lot of factors that are affecting workers' agency, but I think there is still more work that can be done, at least to get that accurate information out to workers to help inform the decisions that they're making.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That's really interesting. Transparency being so important, and also using some tools that already exist in the market today for employers or customers of in other areas, other sectors, other fields, to deploy those into the hands of workers to give them more of a voice. I think it's a really interesting idea and something that we hope to see more of going forward as we try to move the worker from the seat of the beneficiary, as we might think of them, into the seat of the client, and trying to please the client as the main stakeholder that we're trying to serve in this space. Tom, how about you? What is your experience in Walmart regarding worker agency?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I'll build on Hannah's points. I think one of the bits that we're seeing, generate a lot of interest and success is around this information piece. Kind of, maybe it's overly simplifying it, but a lot of the time, we have all been immersed in this topic area and can talk about it, for hours on end. But it's still explaining to workers kind of what brands' expectations are up in the supply chain is still something that needs to be done at scale. And coming from organizations like ourselves, so I think the team, it was last year, I think they put out this kind of refreshed communication on what the kind of Walmart expectation was. Getting those things circulated out can really help kind of break some of this misinformation that exists out there, and for it to be a recognized brand as well. So kind of workers can actually really understand what this topic is, and for them to really understand, what information exists out there for kind of organizations and guidance. So I think it's one of those things that's always been there since the start, this whole kind of topic and agenda, and we mustn't lose focus of some of the kind of simple pieces about just getting the right information out there in the right context, and kind of breaking down some of this misinformation that, as we heard earlier, is only getting worse with some of these kind of bad actors in the supply chain. So it's really important for organizations like us and others just to keep putting pressure on getting the right information out to the right people.
Great, thank you so much. And Ben, I know that worker agency is an important part of the remediation work that Impact has established. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the worker agency side of things, we still find at Impact that there's just no substitute or no substitute as effective as speaking with workers directly in a human way, one-on-one, or in very small groups in our the investigations and the assessments that we do. And this should actually be no exception. So where workers are being recruited in the candidate process, we would still absolutely recommend that there is some form of touch point in terms of speaking with candidates during their recruitment journey. This can still be on a very small scale, because we know that the scale of recruitment at some companies is absolutely astronomical. So we're not saying you need to hit a certain percentage or you need to get a certain sample size, but at least knowing the various risks in your recruitment chains, you can then target places which will be particularly higher risk of recruitment fees or other forms of exploitation, to have some direct interviews, with third-party assistance, using third-party experts where it's appropriate, or doing it through support with buyers or with other companies even, can really help to humanize the process, rather than relying on apps and surveys and technology and things. It can really help humanize and get the information directly from the workers. I completely agree with Hannah and Tom that the information that workers are receiving about the job role that they will then be doing is incredibly important, because that whole part can just be so misleading to workers, and again also dehumanizing. So what we've seen good practice in the past 12 months has been where companies, and this has been at the more micro scale, but it certainly can be replicated and scaled. But we've seen HR managers, operational managers travel to worker origin countries, go to the recruitment drives themselves, speak about their company, hand out pamphlets on the job role, do an FAQ with the workers, outline the exact recruitment process that is going to take place, the different touch points that they're going to have with different officials, with medical, with security clearance, all these kind of things. So it's all laid out in a very clear pamphlet, and also to hand out their own grievance numbers. So the point I was talking to earlier, we've seen examples where these HR heads would be saying to the workers, this number isn't just a kind of a number in the ether. try calling it now and it will call their number and it's their phone in their own pocket, and they can see that after having met these managers that they will potentially be working for in future, and just building that element of trust to the whole process. So that, combined with touch points of actually interviewing workers one-on-one, using third-party experts as it's appropriate through that recruitment process, is really essential. Combining that with a robust set of policies in terms of service level agreements between company and recruitment agency, to make sure that it's not only have they signed up for the employer pays principle, it's actually saying, do you also have a grievance mechanism? You can use ours if ours is successful, or we can use a third party one, and building in an actual requirement that they share that with the candidates during their recruitment journey. So it's not simply having one, it's actively sharing it. And that can then be tested through due diligence from when the company is speaking with the workers in these one-on-one interviews that I was talking about. They're actually checking with the candidate, they're checking with the candidate, are you aware of this phone number? Have you used it? Have there been, do you trust it? Do your friends trust it? All these kinds of questions to build in a multi-layered due diligence approach to making sure that these workers, that these candidates have the avenues by which they can ask questions and check on the process, and making sure that they understand the job role that they're going to get. Because we see, deception is a huge concern during recruitment. So a lot of the questions that candidates may be asking may indeed be around, are they even going to the right location, as well as, all the contractual terms that we're talking about. So these kind of avenues of due diligence and providing agency to workers to ask these questions and just make simple checks on things are all critically important.
Thank you, Ben. That is a great point. The combination of worker touch points with the robust standards and mechanisms is crucial. And I think we're seeing more and more of that across all of the different initiatives and collaborators in the space. It's become more common, and also technology is making it much easier now than it was even a handful of years ago. So as a final point, I'll just ask if there are threads from this conversation that anyone would like to pick up on, or closing words that would like to leave with our audience. I know, Hannah, you had some interesting things to say about clients, workers as clients rather than beneficiaries. So I'll perhaps hand it to you first.
Yeah, what you said there, Alicia, just really rang true in terms of the guidance that we promote through Stronger Together as well. So yeah, seeing workers as customers or as clients rather than as the beneficiaries, and promoting that worker-centered culture. So going beyond those effective feedback and grievance mechanisms to sort of truly integrate the voice and opinions of workers throughout recruitment and employment, and then take proactive steps to improve their experience. So getting their direct feedback on how was the recruitment process and employment experience for them, and building that into a kind of continuous improvement approach to responsible recruitment. And yeah, we have kind of practical guidance on that within our responsible recruitment toolkit. I also wanted to pick up on those earlier conversations about costing out the true cost of the employer pays principle. That initial analysis that I spoke about in my first question, I do want to caveat that that's very much an initial analysis, and that cost of 3 to 6% was the cost from the grower to the retailer rather than necessarily to the consumer. But that analysis has helped to kind of get a starting point of a figure that we can then hopefully explore in more detail with a more kind of robust economic analysis. But I think it has been helpful to at least have a figure to bring those conversations, and enable some of the retailers to take those initial conversations to their commercial teams. And I do think that kind of the true cost it is important for us to make progress on scaling the employer pays principle.
Absolutely agreed, and thank you for the caveat and the clarification on the 3 to 6%. That's good information to have. And Ben, I think you had a point around worker agency and some examples. If you wanted to share those.
Yeah, just to kind of add to the points we were just discussing around, making work as a client, not just a beneficiary. What one really interesting thing that we found in our 6-year project in Qatar. Impact was visiting Qatar every 3 months, and we've spoken to over 5,000 workers there on worker welfare, based on the worker welfare standards of the Supreme Committee there. There was a huge program there on which we helped the Supreme Committee to develop on repayment of recruitment fees, called the Supreme Committee Universal Reimbursement Scheme. This paid back around 30 million US dollars to workers during that time. What we found is that this kind of communication point with workers is just critically important, and it's evidenced by the workers who were receiving this money without a proper explanation or an understanding of what the money was for, were 10 to 15% less satisfied due to lower feelings of respect, compared with workers who were receiving the same amount of money for the same reason, but had it properly explained through conversations, through FAQs, and who had proper access to these kinds of mechanisms and worker feedback sort of forums. And so that difference is really indicative across that huge worker base, to just show how important that is. And on a more qualitative level, because it's a bit difficult to sort of talk about or measure kind of worker productivity at this scale in the program we were doing. But on a qualitative level, the worker feedback we were getting from that second group of workers who did have this, the reasoning explained behind the payment, and therefore had higher feelings of respect. They were just much more happy to be at their companies. They felt much more respected. They wanted to stay with their companies, compared to, the broad range of workers we were speaking to who might have received this money but didn't know what it was for. They tended to be much more likely to want to move on, to go home, to not want to recommend this job to other people. So that feedback point, it's not just about the money, it's about actually humanizing the workforce, which we found incredibly important.
Thank you. What a great point. Thank you for sharing that with us. Tom, wrapping it up, is there anything that you'd like to add as final words for the panel today?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's a hard one. It's a hard one to follow up on that. It's a great point. But I think just broadly, for those kind of listening and participating in this event, I think this, everyone can see the big challenges that kind of lie ahead, and the importance of big brands like ourselves and others really kind of stepping up and making big, bold commitments that can really help shift the landscape, the industry, influence governments, other brands. I think it's critical for those of you that haven't already stepped up to kind of make a big mark on this issue and show your commitment.
What a great final rallying call. Thank you so much for that. And to our audience, I'll just say that we know many of you have a lot of ideas or experiences that you could also add to this conversation. So I'll speak for myself and our panelists. We'll say, please reach out to me or Hannah, Tom, or Ben to individually share your experiences, your lessons learned, opportunities for collaboration. I think everyone here on this panel today is very open and willing to collaborate and share. And it's been a really nice experience to be here today. And we want this not to be the end of the conversation, but to continue speaking with our audience and with each other as well. So thank you for participating, to our panelists, and thank you to the audience for your attention, and to IHRB for the opportunity for us all to get together and speak today. Have a wonderful rest of the event.